Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're doing a deep dive into the Roman Gladiator. This is a figure who, really embodies the most extreme, the most brutal, and also the most sophisticated parts of Roman civilization.
Exactly. For hundreds of years, these fighters were so much more than just entertainers.
Right. They were this nexus point of ritual, political propaganda, and, well, high-stakes sport.
And that combination is what makes the source material so rich. The arena was where the intense hierarchical structure of Roman life was just on full display.
It's where the harsh reality of slavery met the immense, almost boundless power of the state.
It really was. So our mission here is to trace the complete arc of the games. We'll start with their curious origins and funeral rites, go through their spectacular zenith as, instruments of imperial power.
And finally, to their definitive legislative end.
Exactly.
And when we talk about the power and the threat that a single one of these figures could hold, we have to start with the gladiator who completely broke the script, Spartacus.
Absolutely. Spartacus, he was active between, 73 and 71 BCE. He wasn't just known for his skill in the arena.
No, his legacy is really about what he did outside of it.
That's it. He led the most successful and frankly terrifying slave uprising in all of Roman history. It really illustrates that these figures, who were meticulously trained and controlled by the state, bore spectacle.
Also had this explosive potential to become its greatest existential threat.
That immediately establishes the fundamental paradox we're going to be exploring.
These were controlled commodities, right? Designed to reinforce Roman dominance.
Yet they were also these incredibly potent symbols of resistance. It's the tension between absolute control on one hand and the dangerous level of military skill the Romans themselves were teaching them.
The rebellion forced Rome to confront the reality that turning men into trained killing machines, even just for entertainment, carried, massive risks.
So if Spartacus represents that ultimate threat, the danger of the gladiator system, let's rewind a bit.
Yeah, where did this even begin? Because the popular image is, stadiums packed with cheering crowds. But the origins are much more solemn.
They really are. What's fascinating here is that the gladiatorial games likely started not in Rome, but with the Etruscans, possibly in the 3rd century BCE.
The Etruscans.
Yes, and they began as something called munera, which were ritual combats performed at funerals. The purpose was spiritual, not theatrical. It was a blood sacrifice to honor or maybe appease the spirit of the deceased.
So the violence was functional at first. It was tied to a religious duty. How did that solemn funeral rite transform into the huge popular spectacle we all think of?
Well, it was a gradual Roman appropriation and an escalation. By the late Republic and definitely into the early Empire, so the 1st century BCE onwards, the Romans had adopted and massively expanded the tradition.
They moved it from a private funeral to the public stage.
Exactly. Once Rome centralized its power, these events became completely integral to political life.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? The political utility of blood. Hosting these lavish events wasn't just philanthropy.
Not at all. It was statecraft. Wealthy elites, and especially the emperors, they quickly realized the power of controlling the public mood through distraction and spectacle. The games became this crucial component of what the poet Juvenal famously called panem et circenses.
Bread and circuses.
The very same.
The idea being, give the masses free food and incredibly compelling entertainment, and they won't pay too much attention to, say, a failing government or corruption.
Precisely. It was a deliberate strategy. The games demonstrated 3 things all at once. Rome's ability to import exotic resources like wild beasts,
Its mastery over foreign enemies, prisoners of war,
and the sheer inexhaustible wealth of the emperor. Throwing a festival that lasted for months, featuring thousands of fighters, wasn't just PR. It was this loud declaration of imperial dominance over life and death itself.
Okay, so let's turn to the men themselves. If you were a gladiator, the sources are very clear. Most were enslaved, prisoners of war, or criminals, and their life was defined by grueling training.
The training in the Ludus, the gladiator school, was exceptionally harsh, but it was also systematic. These were not untrained brawlers. They were highly specialized, weaponized athletes, drilled for duels of spectacle.
Why the emphasis on specialized duels over just, a giant brawl? Wouldn't that be just as exciting?
Not to the Romans. They valued virtus, a specific type of martial skill and bravery. By having gladiators specialize, you create these matchups.
Like the heavily armored Murmillo with his fish crest helmet and big shield.
Pitted against the swift net and trident-wielding Retiarius. Yeah. The duels became a demonstration of skill and courage, not just slaughter. It added a kind of intellectual drama to the bloodshed.
Okay, but here's that huge paradox again. These men were slaves. Legally, they were defined by infamia, the lowest possible status in Roman society, almost less than human. Yet they became the biggest celebrities of their day. How did Roman society square that legal contempt with this massive public adoration?
That is the ultimate tension of the system. Their legal status was null, they were disposable property, and yet a highly successful gladiator was a superstar.
His name would be on walls, on merchandise.
He was the subject of intense fan worship. They were simultaneously the most reviled and the most recognized figures in Rome. It's an incredible contradiction.
So if they survived, they could earn serious money, maybe even their freedom, and certainly a level of flum you could compare to modern sports idols.
And that potential payoff, not just money, but the intoxicating adoration of the crowd, was so powerful that we see this highly unusual phenomenon of free citizens, even men of good standing, and some aristocratic women.
Volunteering.
They would sign a contract to temporarily embrace infamia and risk death for a shot at glory and wealth.
That is just a mixture of desperation and pure, raw ambition. Let's move to the point where this all reached its maximum scale, the golden age of imperial excess.
This high point is definitively the age of the powerful emperors, running into the 2nd century CE. Specifically the reigns of men like Trajan.
Right, Rome was at its geopolitical peak then, immensely wealthy, stable.
And the games serve to reflect that boundless power. We have pretty concrete details about Emperor Trajan's games in the early 2nd century, held to celebrate his conquest of Dacia.
And these weren't just big spectacles. They were designed to be impossible to replicate, ensuring no one could challenge the emperor's power.
They were political theater on a monstrous scale. Trajan's celebration lasted an astonishing 123 days.
123 days.
Just think about that. 4 months of continuous spectacles. Our sources estimate over 10,000 gladiators fought and maybe 11,000 animals were killed in the hunts.
The logistics alone, just importing the animals from across the empire and housing the fighters for that long.
It was an explicit, undeniable demonstration of absolute control over all resources. It sent a message. We are so rich, we can afford to kill 10,000 trained men and 11,000 exotic animals just to celebrate a victory.
That is profound power projection.
And it secured his place as Optimus Princeps, the best leader in the eyes of the Roman people. This was the zenith, where the games were culturally indispensable and financially boundless.
But of course things fall apart. What were the first significant cracks that signaled the end of this deeply ingrained cultural practice?
Well, the decline was twofold. First, you have economic instability. The crisis of the 3rd century, starting in the mid-200s CE, plunged the empire into military and financial turmoil.
And when the economy is collapsing and the state is fighting for survival, you simply can't afford to sponsor a 123-day festival.
Precisely. The quality and the frequency of the games just plummeted because the resources weren't there anymore. At the same time, a powerful moral counterforce was emerging: Christianity.
As Christianity grew, and particularly after it got official imperial favor in the 4th century, the moral opposition to blood sports became a legislative problem, not just a philosophical one.
Christian leaders publicly and vehemently condemned the games. They argued that the deliberate shedding of human blood for entertainment violated fundamental moral and religious beliefs, and that put immense pressure on the newly Christianized emperors.
So we start to see the legal and moral structure shift. What were the key legislative steps that led to the final permanent ban?
Emperor Constantine, in the early 4th century, he took the initial steps. He tried to curb the worst excesses, sending criminals to the mines instead of the arena. But the definitive action came a century later under Emperor Honorius.
Right, and Honorius is the one who permanently banned gladiatorial games in 404 CE. And there's a dramatic, specific reason tied to that final decision, isn't there?
There is. The end came not from a bureaucratic decree, but because of a shocking public tragedy. Honorius acted after a monk named Telemachus entered the arena to intervene in a fight.
He was appealing for peace on religious grounds.
He was, and he was killed by the furious crowd, or maybe the gladiators themselves. The sources are a bit unclear on the specifics.
A single act of sacrifice which the emperor then used as the final impetus to shut down a practice that had defined Roman culture for over 4 centuries.
It just shows how a single dramatic event can crystallize all these underlying moral and economic pressures into decisive legislative action. Organized gladiatorial combat ended as public entertainment in the West.
Though some animal hunts persisted for a bit longer.
A little bit longer, yes. But the main spectacle had lost its economic viability and its moral sanction.
The story of the gladiator is a perfect microcosm of Roman history, isn't it? It shows the power of the state to create this social theater that both glorified and dehumanized people.
It reflected the allure of spectacle and the harsh realities of slavery, right up until the point where new cultural and religious values just completely upended the old order.
And this leaves you, the listener, with a challenging question about cultural resilience. When you look at the collapse of this ancient, deeply ingrained practice, what's the ultimate deciding factor?
Does it take economic collapse to make it impossible? Does it require a sweeping moral revolution? Or does change only happen when that final shocking act forces the legislative hand? That interplay of forces is something worth pondering when you consider any fundamental societal shift. Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, when you say Roman gladiator, most of us, we get this one sort of generic image in our heads.
Right, a guy in some armor with a sword.
Exactly. But that idea is, well, it's way too simple. Today we're stepping into the Colosseum to really unpack how the world of gladiators was this highly specialized, almost professional ecosystem.
They were professional athletes, really. And we often treat them as just interchangeable fighters, but the sources show a world of very distinct combat roles.
So our mission for this deep dive is to trace how their equipment changed, how it went from, just copying Rome's enemies to becoming these symbolic, tailored tools for pure spectacle.
And that evolution, it really reflects everything about Rome. Its military, its cultural expansion, and of course its changing tastes in entertainment.
I think the starting point is just fascinating, how it all began with Rome's own military expansion. The first gladiators were, in a way, walking trophies. They were kitted out in the gear of the people Rome had just defeated.
That's the crucial context. When the games started, they were often tied to funeral rites. And the fighters would literally wear the arms and armor of Rome's biggest rivals.
So it's less about entertainment and more of a victory lap.
It's a triumphal display. It's a way of reminding the public constantly that Roman military power was absolute.
Okay, so who are we talking about here? Which defeated enemies became, the first types in the arena?
Well, you're looking mainly at 3 foundational types that came right out of those military campaigns. The Thracian, the Gaul, and the Samnite.
Right, all named after peoples Rome fought.
Exactly. Their styles were deeply rooted in those cultures.
So let's start with the Samnite. They were one of the earliest, right? Named after one of Rome's great early rivals.
They were. The Samnite was your classic heavy infantry type. They had a big oval shield, the scutum, and a helmet with this big crest or plume.
So pretty intimidating.
Very. A greave on their left leg, a short sword. They looked formidable, and that probably reflects the respect or maybe the fear Rome had for them before they were finally beaten.
And then you have the Thracian, whose gear just screamed, foreigner?
Oh, it did. The Thracian was instantly recognizable. They had a much smaller rectangular shield. But their weapon was the most distinctive thing in the arena.
The Sicca.
The Sicca. That short, curved sword. It was designed to hook around an opponent's shield to get behind their armor. It was a very tricky weapon to face.
So a much lighter, faster style than the Samnite?
Completely different. All about speed.
And the Gaulish type, they were heavier again, weren't they?
Back to heavy armor, a big helmet, and they used the classic Roman short sword, the gladius.
So even in this early phase, you can see Rome deliberately setting up these uneven fights. It creates an instant tension.
Yeah, it's the takeaway. The gear was, it was a political statement. It was cultural appropriation. You're mimicking these ethnic origins to prove Roman superiority. But as the empire grew and conquest became just another Tuesday, the public wanted more. They wanted more theater.
And that's where it gets really interesting. The gear stops being about military reality and starts becoming, pure show business.
The shift is profound.
The designers in the Ludus, the gladiator schools, they started engineering fighters for dramatic contrast. They needed the quick guy versus the strong guy.
Exactly. The spectacle demanded it. You couldn't just have 2 heavily armored guys slugging it out. You needed clear differences, clear vulnerabilities.
Which brings us to the most iconic pairing of all time, The Murmillo versus the Retiarius.
The absolute case study in specialization.
I mean, if you design two fighters to be polar opposites, this is what you'd get.
Absolutely. The Murmillo was the heavy fighter. He kind of evolved from the old Gaulish types, pure defense, pure endurance.
And he's got that massive rectangular shield, the scutum.
Which basically makes him a walking wall.
A fortress, yeah. So what else was he wearing?
Heavy protection. An arm guard, the manica, and that very distinctive helmet with a big crest, sometimes shaped like a fish, which is where the name comes from. And a full face grill. This was armor built for someone who could take a beating and keep coming.
Now, you contrast that walking tank with the Retiarius.
Yeah.
Visually, that must have been a shock for the crowd.
A total shock. The Retiarius was, he was almost naked by comparison. He was all about agility and speed, and this is the key. He fought without a helmet.
No helmet. That's a huge disadvantage.
It's a huge vulnerability, but it also makes him instantly recognizable. He's the nimble, cunning underdog.
And his equipment was purely strategic, almost like psychological warfare.
It was. His whole arsenal was the trident, a dagger, the pugio for when things got close, and of course the weighted net, the reed.
So his whole game plan was to not fight, really.
Exactly. Avoid the fight, trap your opponent in the net, neutralize that massive shield, and then strike.
It's the fisherman versus the soldier. It's the perfect dramatic setup.
It ensured every match was a tactical dance, not just a brawl. But now the arena designers have a new problem.
How do you beat the net?
Right. You have to invent a counterfighter.
Which brings us to the peak of this whole engineering process. The Secutor. The chaser.
The Secutor was created for one reason, and one reason only. To counter the Retiarius. They took the heavy armor of the Murmillo, the big shield, the Gladius, but the helmet was the real game changer.
The famous smooth helmet. That detail from the sources is just brilliant.
It's incredible. The Secutor's helmet was totally smooth, rounded, no crest, no decorations at all, and it was for that one critical reason.
So the net just slides right off.
It can't catch, it can't snag on anything. It's basically anti-net technology.
But that helmet must have been miserable to wear.
Oh, it was a serious trade-off. The eye holes were tiny, so your peripheral vision was almost zero.
Right, stop the trident.
And that smooth enclosed design meant it got incredibly hot in there. They were called the chaser because they had to end the fight fast before they literally collapsed from heat exhaustion.
A race against time. So how much of this gear is about fighting and how much is about, managing the story of the fight?
By the time you get to the Imperial period, it's almost all spectacle, all symbolism.
You see that with other types too, like the hoplamachi?
Exactly. The hoplamachi. They're heavily armored, fighting with a lance, the hasta, and a sword. But their name and their helmet style, it's all meant to look Greek.
Like a Greek hoplite soldier.
Precisely. These types weren't just fighting, they were evoking an image. Their gear was tapping into Rome's own mythology about itself.
So a gladiator's equipment wasn't just protection, it was a costume in a political play.
It was. The crowd wasn't just watching a fight, they were watching a myth play out. The heavy armor meant discipline and strength Roman values. The light armor and nets meant cunning and wildness, which made for a great underdog story.
This all points to an incredible level of professionalism, doesn't it? These weren't just random people thrown in there.
No, not at all. The sources are clear. Gladiators were trained rigorously and they specialized in one class.
And the gear must have dictated the entire training program.
It had to. The heavy guys spent all their time building the strength to carry that huge shield and armor.
While the Retiari are practicing footwork and, I imagine, learning the very difficult skill of throwing a net accurately while someone's trying to kill you.
It's a tailor-made curriculum, and it creates this closed loop. The spectacle demands specialized gear, and the gear demands specialized training. It guaranteed that every fight had this built-in dramatic tension.
This has really been a deep dive into the engineering of it all. The evolution of the gladiator is like a perfect microcosm of Roman society itself.
It really is. It moves from a simple statement of conquest to this highly refined form of political theater.
From just copying your enemy.
To designing counterfighters like the Secutor, to creating symbolic power armor like the hoplamachi. The whole system is this perfect, if brutal, blend of martial skill, equipment design, and political messaging.
So we'll leave you with a final thought on this. The next time you picture a Roman gladiator, Remember that every single piece of gear they wore, from that huge defensive scutum to the slippery specialized helmet of the Secutor, was an act of intentional theatrical design. It was engineered not for a battlefield, but to reinforce a story of Roman power in the most dramatic way possible. And maybe think about how modern spectacle sports entertainment still uses equipment and costumes to tell us a story about heroism, struggle, and what we're supposed to value.
Thank you for joining us.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive. When you think about the Roman Colosseum, what usually comes to mind is, the main event.
Right.
The roar of the crowd, the dust, the blood. We always focus right on that climax of the violence.
Of course, that's the part that's been immortalized. But today, we're going to go completely backstage.
And we really have to.
We do, because that spectacle, that massive, unbelievably complex show that really defined Roman public life, it wasn't just random violence. Not at all.
No.
It was fueled by this highly organized, heavily capitalized, and intensely regulated infrastructure. So today we're doing a deep dive into the system that actually built the fighters.
Yeah.
The gladiatorial school or the Ludus.
And that's our mission. We're taking a close look at the training and power structure inside these Ludus. We want to figure out how these disciplined, frankly brutal institutions could transform such a diverse group of people into these incredibly skilled combatants.
And in doing that, they sustained Rome's biggest public feature and, maybe more importantly, projected the power of the Roman state.
So the source material we're looking at today, it goes way back. Oh,
yeah. It shows these institutions were established as early as the 3rd century BCE. This was a long-term investment by the state. These weren't just gyms, they were total institutions designed to, standardize and perfect violence.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly was a ludus? Structurally, I mean. To me, it sounds almost like a factory floor for warriors.
That's a great way to put it. It was, under incredibly strict management.
Right.
The Ludus were these dedicated, permanent facilities. They were responsible for housing, training, maintaining, and even deploying gladiators. You can't overstate how essential they were.
So if the arena was the theater,
then the Ludus was the meticulously managed production company. It ensured the quality and, the consistency of the performers.
and the people they were pulling in, the recruitment pool was just fascinatingly diverse. It wasn't just slaves.
Not at all. That's a common misconception.
Yeah.
Slaves were a huge source, of course, often from conquered territories or sold into it.
And you had criminals, prisoners of war,
Exactly. But here's the detail that people often miss. The octorati.
the volunteers, which just seems insane. People signing up for this willingly.
Yes. And for all sorts of reasons. Crippling debt, a need for fame, maybe even a genuine thirst for combat. They voluntarily signed up. They signed a legal contract, the Sacramentum Gladiatorium.
And what did that mean legally?
It essentially meant you were swearing to be, quote, burnt, bound, beaten, and killed by the sword.
Wow.
And that act, that oath, it instantly stripped them of their full rights. They were classified as infamia.
So it didn't matter if you were a captured slave or a broke Roman citizen. The moment you took that oath, you were at the bottom of the social ladder.
Exactly. Even if you became a celebrity fighter. It shows how the system transformed your legal status just as much as your physical ability.
It's a remarkable tool of social control.
It is. Because no matter your background, the Ludus had one single goal: to take this raw, legally compromised material and mold it into a predictable, skilled, and crucially entertaining performer.
Okay, that word entertaining, that brings us right to the training. It had to be militaristic, I assume.
It was more than militaristic. It was highly specialized and brutal. The whole thing was run by the lanista.
The owner.
The owner, but also the general manager, responsible for discipline and profit. The regimen was incredibly rigid. A strict schedule of drills designed not just to kill, but for showmanship.
Let's talk about that discipline. I'm guessing we're talking about more than just drills and sprints.
We are talking about complete authoritarian control. Discipline was maintained with some pretty harsh tools like the ferulae, these thick canes used for any infraction. And the training wasn't about being lean and fit in a general sense.
No.
No, it was about specialized endurance and weapon mastery, all tailored for what the crowd wanted to see in the arena.
And the sources say this was customized, right? Based on the type of gladiator you were going to be.
Oh, absolutely.
You couldn't train a light, agile Retiarius.
The same way you trained a heavily armored Murmillo. Exactly. That specialization is what justified the whole school infrastructure.
So a Murmillo would focus on what? Strength.
Strength, yes. Shield work. close quarters, grappling in heavy armor. Their whole goal was to survive a direct, brutal, face-to-face exchange.
While the Retiarius, the guy with the net and trident, was the complete opposite.
Total opposite. They were masters of evasion, of entanglement. Their training was all about agility, speed, using that net to disable and create distance.
So they were trying to wear the other guy out.
Precisely. They were light and fast, trying to make the heavy fighter exhaust himself. These completely different tactical styles had to exist and be perfected under the same roof.
It really does sound like an elite athletic facility. But that leads to this fascinating contradiction that I want to unpack.
Okay.
If these fighters were such valuable, highly trained, expensive assets, how did the Lanista manage the economic reality that they were, expected to fight to the death?
That is the essential contradiction of the entire system. You've hit on it exactly. They were valuable assets, yes, but the entertainment demanded a certain mortality rate.
So how did they solve that?
Well, the schools addressed it by offering what were, for the time, state-of-the-art support systems. Far better than what the average Roman citizen, let alone a slave, would ever receive.
Like what?
Sophisticated medical care, for one. It was essential. They had dedicated physicians, often specialists in trauma, because if you could heal someone quickly, you could get them back in the arena faster.
And that means more profit.
Exactly. And maybe the most surprising detail is their diet. Gladiators were often called horderai,
which means
barley eaters.
Barley eaters, so a diet based on grains and legumes.
Almost vegetarian, yes. Very high in carbohydrates. This wasn't about getting lean or maximizing muscle definition. It was about achieving bulk.
Bulk? What?
For a layer of subcutaneous fat. That fat was believed to provide a cushion against cuts and blows, protecting the valuable organs underneath. It was also thought to help with faster healing. It just shows how pragmatic the schools were.
Wow, so it wasn't about fitness in the way we think of it. It was about optimizing the body as a protective shell.
That's it. A shell against the inherent danger of their job. This level of organization, it had to have a sort of an apex institution.
It did. The Ludus Magnus, the big one, right in the heart of Rome. And its location, that says everything.
It says everything about its importance to the state. It wasn't just the biggest or most famous.
It was literally right next to the Colosseum.
Yes, connected by an underground tunnel. That proximity made access for events seamless, and it symbolized the school's strategic role in supplying the spectacle. The Ludus Magnus was a state operation. It solidified the government's control over the entire violence industry.
So we're moving from just physical infrastructure to a political role. These schools weren't just supplying fighters, they were cultural hubs.
Yes, reinforcing core Roman values. Every victory in the arena reinforced Roman ideals of masculinity.
Courage, martial skill.
Resilience, the ability to face death with dignity. The gladiator, even a slave, became this living, brutal lesson in Roman virtue.
But if you're training all these highly lethal specialists in one place, that creates a huge political and security risk.
An immense risk.
Yeah.
Especially if they decide to turn those skills against you.
So at what point did the state say, okay, we can't rely on private enterprise for this anymore, we need direct control?
That realization was driven by absolute terror. The memory of Spartacus, who was himself a highly trained gladiator from Ludus, haunted the Roman elite.
Right. He organized that massive slave uprising in the 70s BCE.
And they saw just how quickly that discipline and those combat skills could be turned against them. It was a terrifying wake-up call.
So the Ludi, which started as a private business for entertainment, became something the state had to manage directly.
Had to.
How do they do that? Legally.
After Spartacus, the regulation was twofold. First, they regulated the number of gladiators allowed in any one place, especially near Rome, to sort of cap the potential number of rebels.
Okay, that makes sense.
And second, and this was more important, they asserted control over the spectacles themselves by regulating the editor.
The official who funded the games. The person paying the bills.
The person paying the bill was now controlled by the state. By controlling the editor, the state controlled the demand, and by extension, the entire supply chain coming out of the Ludi.
So they could ensure the political reliability of the whole thing?
And guarantee that Rome would always have the fighters it needed, but under terms the state dictated. That centralized control is what transformed the schools from just training grounds into essential tools of imperial governance.
And that really is the critical point for you, the listener, to take away. The gladiatorial schools were these foundational institutions, often overlooked, that made Rome's iconic spectacles possible. They were sophisticated, they were disciplined, and they were utterly necessary for manufacturing Roman power, both culturally and militarily.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought. We've seen how these schools, dedicated to crafting lethal performers for public entertainment, were also the ultimate tool for social and political control.
Through extreme discipline and standardization.
Exactly. So consider how highly specialized discipline training, whether it's in an ancient Ludus or a modern military academy, is always fundamentally about optimizing a projection of physical capability, and how that projection inevitably connects back to systems of centralized authority and state power.